Understood. Here's section 1 of your script, written in a faceless, narration-driven style with minimum 760 words, keeping it tight, to the point, and emotionally layered without repeating or dragging. I was never meant to belong in their world. The Morgan house stood tall, polished, and distant, like something taken straight from a magazine cover. To me, it was only a workplace, a place where my hands scrubbed surfaces, folded clothes, and polished glass until I could see my reflection staring back. But behind the glass, behind the walls, there was a silence I couldn't ignore. I was Amelia Carter, the housekeeper. I entered each morning quietly, never overstaying, never asking questions. Yet, the more time I spent there, the harder it became to ignore the cracks hidden beneath all that perfection. From the outside, Daniel and Isabella Morgan looked untouchable. Wealthy, beautiful, admired by neighbors. People whispered about their perfect marriage, their glamorous life, the love they must have shared. Inside, I saw something different. Isabella was elegance personified. Her beauty was effortless, her presence commanding. She was the kind of woman people stopped to look at when she walked into a room, even if she said nothing. But beauty doesn't mean warmth. She was distant, her voice often clipped, her smile more rehearsed than real. She had a busy schedule, meetings, events, brunches with friends who looked just like her, perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect lives. When she was home, her attention seemed anywhere but on her husband. Daniel, however, was different. He was approachable, warm in a way that caught me off guard. He greeted me every morning, sometimes stopping to ask if I was doing okay, or if I needed help carrying something. Small gestures that I brushed off at first, thinking it was just kindness. But it was more than I was used to. He carried himself with confidence, but I could sense something beneath the surface, a restlessness. His eyes sometimes followed Isabella when she passed by, not with admiration but with a quiet longing, as though he was reaching for something he could no longer hold. When she dismissed him with a half-hearted smile or a distracted nod, I noticed. When he tried to share a story and she scrolled through her phone, I noticed. Silence became their language, and I was there to witness it. I told myself I shouldn't pay attention, that I was just the housekeeper. My job was to clean, not to understand. But it was impossible not to see it, impossible not to feel it in the air around me. Their marriage was like their home, beautiful, polished, but fragile beneath the shine. I began to feel uneasy in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't my place to think about them, but I couldn't stop. Every detail became clearer over time, the way Isabella rarely touched him, the way Daniel's shoulders dropped whenever she left the room, the long nights when the house echoed with absence rather than intimacy, and then, there was the way Daniel looked at me. At first, I ignored it. A glance too long, a smile that lingered. I brushed it off, convinced I was imagining things. But slowly, I realized it wasn't in my head. He noticed me. Not just as the housekeeper, but as someone who existed in his world when no one else seemed to. That terrified me. Because I knew better. I knew what lines shouldn't be crossed, what boundaries weren't meant to bend. And yet, the awareness was there, quietly growing, silently pulsing every time he stood too close or asked about my day. It wasn't flirtation, not openly. It was something subtler, something dangerous. I kept reminding myself of who I was in that house. I didn't belong in their world of tailored suits and evening dinners, of expensive wines and curated lives. I was an outsider who stepped into their perfect image just to clean up the mess they didn't want to acknowledge. But sometimes, the outsider sees more clearly than anyone else, and what I saw was loneliness, his, hers, and eventually mine. Loneliness that filled the rooms more than laughter ever did. I began to carry that weight home with me, thinking about it when I should have been thinking about anything else. Thinking about him. Thinking about the silence that wasn't mine to break. I told myself to stop, to focus on my work, to close my eyes to what was happening right in front of me. But when you're inside a house long enough, you start to feel its heartbeat. And in that house, the beat was irregular, heavy, and fragile. Every corner I polished, every room I entered, the truth became clearer. This wasn't the story people imagined from the outside. Behind those walls was a marriage built on appearances, not connection. And I was standing in the middle of it, quietly watching, quietly knowing that I didn't belong, and yet, part of me felt drawn in, as though their silence was calling me too. I told myself it was nothing. Just a job, just a house. But even then, deep down, I already knew something was shifting, and sooner or later, I would no longer just be the housekeeper. Word count 770 white heavy check mark. Would you like me to move on and write section 2 in the same style? Minimum 760 words. No repetition. More intense escalation. Understood. Here's section 2 of your script, written in the same faceless, narration-driven style, with minimum 760 words, keeping it focused, tight, and layered with emotion without any unnecessary repetition. Days in the Morgan house began to change, though nothing was spoken aloud. Isabella's schedule grew longer, her absences stretching into evenings and nights. Work trips, charity events, dinners she insisted Daniel wouldn't enjoy. The house felt emptier, and in that emptiness, silence had a way of bringing people closer. Daniel started lingering more when I worked. At first, it was harmless. He'd pour himself a drink and sit at the counter while I prepared dinner for Isabella. He'd ask about my day, about things that no employer had ever cared to know. I tried to keep my answers short, polite, but there was something in his voice, something searching, that made me hesitate to walk away. I told myself it was loneliness. A man left too often in a house that looked more like a museum than a home. And yet, when he spoke to me, it didn't feel like the distant voice of a husband passing time. It felt personal. He asked about my family, my childhood, the dreams I never admitted out loud. He listened, really listened, as if my words mattered. It unsettled me more than it should have. Because I wasn't used to being heard, not like that. And with every conversation, a line I had promised myself I would never cross started to blur. The first time he stood too close, it wasn't deliberate. Or maybe it was. I had been stacking dishes, and when I turned, he was there, his hand brushing mine as he reached to help. The touch was fleeting, but it stayed long after he left the room. I replayed it in my mind, asking myself why it mattered, why it felt like something more. It happened again and again, in different ways. A hand on my shoulder when I bent to pick something up. His fingers grazing mine when he passed me a glass. His voice lower, softer, when it was only the two of us. Each moment innocent on its own, but together they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. I fought against it. I told myself this wasn't my life, this wasn't my story to live. I was here to work, nothing more. But temptation doesn't arrive as a storm, it comes as a whisper, slow and steady, until you don't realize how far you've drifted. One night, Isabella was away again, another weekend conference, another excuse. The house was quiet, too quiet. I had stayed later than usual, finishing tasks I could have left for the morning. Maybe I didn't want to leave, maybe I didn't want to go back to my own silence. Daniel found me in the kitchen, and instead of just thanking me for staying late, he offered me a drink. I should have said no. Every part of me knew I should. But I said yes. The glass trembled in my hand though I tried to steady it. Conversation flowed easier than it should have. He told me about the early days of his marriage, how different things used to be, how time and distance had stolen something he couldn't quite name. His voice carried the weight of confession, not meant for me but given to me anyway. And I listened, though every word felt like a step toward something dangerous. When his hand touched mine again, this time he didn't pull away. Neither did I. The silence between us spoke louder than anything else. I felt guilt, sharp and undeniable, but tangled with it was a longing I had buried for too long. It wasn't just about him. It was about being seen, being wanted, being more than invisible. The moment unraveled quickly after that. A glance held too long became a touch became something neither of us stopped. I told myself it would only be that one time, that the line had been crossed and could be buried again. But the truth was, once it happened, there was no going back. The house that had once been only work became a place of secrets. Every room felt charged, every corner holding memories I shouldn't have carried. My guilt grew heavier, but so did the pull. I told myself I could end it, that I should end it, but the lies were easier than the truth. When Isabella returned, everything looked the same on the surface. She moved through the house with her usual elegance, unaware of the cracks widening beneath her feet. But Daniel's eyes told a different story when they met mine, and mine betrayed me when they lingered on him too long. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about how easily I had let go of the person I thought I was. I wasn't just the housekeeper anymore. I was a secret, a choice, a mistake waiting to be discovered, and yet, in the quiet of my thoughts, I couldn't deny it. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. That was TH.
Here's section 3 of your story, crafted in the same faceless, to the point style, with no repetition, no headings, and a word count of at least 760 words. The lies became harder to contain. Sarah felt them sticking to her skin, heavier with every passing day. What began as small white deceptions, late errands, extra hours at work, friends she claimed to be visiting, were now tangled in a web that demanded constant attention. Daniel was not a suspicious man, but even his patience had limits. He started to notice how distracted she was, how her phone never left her side, how she smiled faintly at nothing when she thought no one was looking. One evening he asked her directly if something was wrong. His voice wasn't accusing, only tired, weary in a way that pierced through her chest. She forced a smile, brushed his hand with hers, and told him she was fine. The words sounded convincing, but his eyes lingered on her longer than usual, searching for cracks she prayed he wouldn't find. That night, as she lay beside him, her body faced one way and his another, the silence between them screamed louder than any confession. Jason, on the other hand, had no hesitation. He pushed her to see him more, sent messages late at night, reminded her of the fire she felt in his presence. He was relentless in his certainty that she belonged to him in ways Daniel would never understand. What terrified her was that she started to believe him. Every time she slipped back into his arms, she lost a little more of her resolve. She felt powerless to stop, like a current pulling her out into open water, but reality has a way of shattering illusions. One careless moment was all it took. Daniel found a message she had forgotten to delete, nothing explicit but intimate enough to erase doubt. She saw it in his eyes when he walked into the room holding her phone. His silence was sharper than any scream. He set the device down in front of her, turned, and left without a word. Her stomach twisted violently, her throat dry, her mind spinning with excuses she couldn't bring herself to say. The following days blurred into a storm of avoidance. Daniel didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. His absence was louder than his presence. He stopped staying late at work, but not to be with her, only to avoid her. They moved through the house like strangers, bound by walls but not by love. She tried to approach him, to explain, but the weight of his gaze when he finally met her eyes left her frozen. It was the look of a man who realized he had lost something he thought was unbreakable. Jason was no savior either. For all his passion, he offered no promises. He was available when it suited him, distant when she asked for more. The very intensity that once drew her in began to expose itself for what it was, desire without depth. She realized, painfully, that she had risked everything for a man who would never choose her in return. What had felt like liberation now tasted like chains. Sarah stood in the middle of both worlds, unwanted in one and unclaimed in the other. She had betrayed Daniel's trust beyond repair, yet Jason was never going to fill the emptiness she carried. For the first time since it began, she saw herself clearly, not as a woman who had found passion, but as someone who had destroyed what little she still had. She thought of the nights when she begged for Daniel's attention, the quiet meals, the unanswered needs. And then she thought of the hunger that drove her to Jason, how quickly it turned to ashes in her hands. Daniel never erupted, never shouted, never struck back. His silence was punishment enough. It was the cold recognition that he no longer saw her as the woman he loved but as the one who had betrayed him. Sarah wanted him to scream, to fight, to give her a chance to argue or justify, but he gave her nothing. The absence of emotion was worse than rage. It told her he had already let go. Jason faded soon after. The text slowed, the meeting stopped, his attention drifted elsewhere, as she had feared it might. She had been a chapter, not a story. She tried to reach for him, but he was never truly hers to begin with. What remained was emptiness, heavier than the loneliness that had started it all. Lying awake one night, Sarah stared at the ceiling. Daniel turned away from her as usual, but this time the space between them was permanent. She thought about how a single choice had unraveled years of promises, how one moment of fire had burned through everything she thought was secure. She knew there would be no returning to what they had, no patch strong enough to cover the fracture. It was bigger, stronger, and beyond anything she thought she wanted. Yet in the end, it left her with nothing but silence, a silence that would echo for the rest of her life. White heavy checkmark. Word count 775 words. Would you like me to now compile all 3 sections into a single seamless 2,000-word story, fully polished and flowing without section breaks, so it reads like one continuous narrative? Here's section 4, minimum 760 words, faceless style, no scenes, no headings, no repetition, straight continuation of aftermath and deepening consequences. Laura had thought the secrecy would suffocate her, that the weight of guilt would become unbearable, yet instead it became a strange kind of oxygen. Every day carried the pulse of danger. Every look across the room filled her with the same thrill she once believed belonged only to younger versions of herself. Ethan was careful, but he was not skilled in concealing the intensity of what they shared. His eyes lingered too long, his tone softened when he spoke to her, his presence too easily betrayed the bond they carried. She had to remind him often with a touch of her hand or a quiet warning that they were always being watched. Even when Daniel seemed blind to the storm swirling inside his own house, Daniel remained unsuspecting, though he had begun to notice small shifts. He commented once that Laura seemed more radiant, more energetic, and she forced a laugh, deflecting the compliment with excuses about new routines and healthier habits. He even praised Ethan for showing maturity, for finally carrying himself like a man instead of a boy, unaware of the truth that maturity had been forced upon him in the most forbidden way. Each word of approval twisted inside Laura, a mixture of pride and dread, as though Daniel himself were unknowingly validating the betrayal. The bond between her and Ethan deepened beyond the physical. Their conversations became longer, more honest, layered with a trust that frightened her with its intensity. He confided in her about his insecurities, about his future, about the feeling of always being overshadowed by his father's expectations. She listened not as a stepmother, not as a wife, but as someone who saw him wholly, flaws and all. In turn, she confessed her loneliness, the emptiness of a marriage that had become more partnership than passion. These exchanges tethered them together in ways more binding than the physical act ever had, for secrets of the heart were far harder to erase. Yet Laura knew the danger lay not just in the act, but in the emotion growing between them. Desire could be explained away as weakness, a fleeting lapse, but the closeness building now was something far more threatening. Ethan looked at her not as a forbidden fling but as though she were the answer to every question he had carried. That intensity terrified her because she recognized a reflection of her own longing in his gaze. The more they shared, the more impossible it became to imagine retreating to the safety of distance. Their moments together grew riskier. Sometimes it was only a touch that lingered too long when Daniel's back was turned, sometimes a whisper that carried more meaning than the words themselves. The walls of the house, once mundane, now held their silence like co-conspirators. Every corner, every shadow, became both refuge and threat. Laura learned to navigate the balance of thrill and fear, living on the edge of discovery with each passing day. The risk no longer repelled her, it sustained her, reminding her she was alive, but nights were cruel. When Daniel reached for her, when he kissed her in passing, when he spoke of plans for their future, Laura felt the split inside her widen. She answered his gestures, but her body betrayed her, remembering another touch, another fire. She despised herself for the duplicity, yet when she thought of Ethan's voice, his eyes, his trembling need, the guilt was powerless against the hunger. She lived in two worlds now, both false in their own way, yet both necessary. Ethan's transformation was undeniable. No longer did he slouch beneath the weight of his embarrassment. He carried himself with confidence, a man no longer ashamed of his body but proud of what had once humiliated him. Laura felt both responsible and complicit, knowing she had given him that strength, but also wondering if she had built something dangerous, an attachment that could not easily be undone. He began to speak of her with reverence, almost devotion, and each word drew her deeper into the trap she herself had opened. She knew this could not last forever. Secrets had a way of bleeding into the open, no matter how carefully they were stitched shut. Yet she could not bring herself to end it. Every time she resolved to step back, one glance, one accidental brush of his hand, pulled her back into the gravity of what they had created. The truth was that she did not want to stop, not yet, not while her heart still raced with every thought of him. The end would come, perhaps disastrously, but the present was too intoxicating to abandon. In the quiet of her own reflection, Laura understood she was no longer the woman she had been before. She was not simply a wife,
not simply a stepmother, she was something more complicated, more dangerous. She had crossed a boundary and built a life in the shadows of her own home. Ethan was no longer just Daniel's son to her, he was the embodiment of every unsatisfied craving, every neglected part of her soul. The line between guilt and desire had blurred so completely that she could no longer see where one ended and the other began. The silence of their secret grew heavier, but neither of them let it break. For now, the truth belonged only to them, carried in glances, in touches, in breaths stolen when no one was watching. Laura did not know how long it would last, or what the price would be when it all unraveled. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: there was no going back. What had begun as shame, as a secret neither dared admit, had become the force reshaping both their lives. And nothing, not even the weight of guilt, could undo the truth of what they had done. Word count 770. Now you have 4 complete sections, each over 760 words, keeping the flow tight and faceless. No filler, no repetition, full emotional and physical progression. Do you want me to now craft the final title and description for this story, in the same style as your previous requests? Understood. Since you asked for section 1 of the infidelity script, minimum 760 words, I'll craft it as a faceless, direct narrative, no scene labels, no headings, no fluff. It will move with clarity, focusing on betrayal, tension, temptation, and emotions. Here's section 1, almost equals 760 words. The silence in their home had become louder than any argument they had ever had. Small exchanges were reduced to reminders about bills, questions about dinner, or comments on errands. Affection, once effortless, now felt like an obligation neither of them cared enough to pretend about anymore. He noticed how she smiled more at her phone than she did at him. She noticed how he spent longer hours outside, inventing reasons to linger away from her company. Both of them sensed the distance, but neither addressed it, because naming it would make it real, and neither had the strength to confront the truth. Head-on.it began innocently, or at least that was the excuse she whispered to herself the first few times. A colleague at work, Daniel, seemed to notice her in ways her husband no longer did. His compliments were subtle, never over the line, but the way his eyes lingered, the way his attention felt heavy on her, made her pulse race in ways she hadn't felt in years. She told herself she enjoyed the validation, nothing more. A little spark in an otherwise dim routine, harmless, controlled, manageable. But sparks, left unchecked, always threatened to become fire. When he first touched her wrist, it wasn't deliberate. Papers exchanged, fingers brushing, the warmth of his skin against hers. It should have meant nothing, yet she carried the ghost of that contact all day. She replayed it during dinner, while nodding absently to her husband's half-hearted recount of his day, her mind elsewhere. She felt alive, and guilty, but the guilt only deepened the thrill. That's how it always begins, the intoxicating mix of wrongness and desire. Meanwhile, her husband wasn't innocent either. He had grown close to someone too, though in a different way. A woman from the gym, Elena, with whom he shared long conversations before and after workouts. She laughed at his jokes, asked him about his goals, challenged him in ways his wife no longer seemed interested in. He told himself it was just friendship, but the time he spent crafting responses to her texts, the small rush he felt when her name lit up his phone, betrayed something deeper. He hadn't crossed the line physically yet, but the emotional tether was undeniable. Their marriage, in truth, was surviving on shadows. Two people under the same roof, hiding secrets in plain sight, both craving what they no longer gave each other. Nights spent scrolling, pretending to sleep, side by side yet worlds apart. Trust had become an unspoken casualty, and routine was the thin glue keeping the facade together. Neither wanted to be the first to admit that something was breaking, so both sought comfort elsewhere, quietly, carefully. For her, Daniel became the forbidden thought she carried into bed. She imagined what it would be like to let his hand stay on hers, to lean into the warmth instead of pulling back. She imagined his voice in her ear, the way he might touch her with the hunger she craved. Those thoughts made her heart race beneath the blankets, while her husband lay inches away, oblivious to the storm she was nurturing inside. She hated herself for wanting it, but the wanting only grew stronger with every encounter. For him, Elena became the mirror he needed. She made him feel younger, stronger, worth listening to. When she asked about his dreams, he realized he hadn't spoken about them in years. With his wife, conversations were practical, functional. With Elena, he felt seen. He found excuses to stay longer at the gym, even when his workouts were done, stretching the minutes into hours because those stolen fragments of connection felt more nourishing than anything waiting for him at home. Neither admitted it out loud, but both knew they were drifting closer to the edge. A point was coming where subtlety would no longer be enough, where unspoken thoughts would demand action. The tension in the air grew thick, unbreakable, and the guilt was no longer a deterrent. Guilt began to feel like part of the ritual, a companion to desire. They didn't stop because part of them no longer wanted to. The most dangerous part of betrayal isn't the moment it happens. It's the long silence before, the justifications, the half-truths you tell yourself to make the impossible seem harmless. She told herself she just needed to feel wanted again. He told himself he just needed someone to remind him he mattered. They convinced themselves it wasn't serious, not yet, nothing that couldn't be erased if they stopped now. But deep down, both of them already knew that lines, once blurred, are never fully redrawn. Their story hadn't reached its breaking point yet, but it was inevitable. Every choice they made in secret was a step toward that collision. A marriage cannot withstand two people living double lives. Trust doesn't survive in shadows. And though they didn't know when or how, they both sensed the reckoning was coming. One night, one truth, and nothing would ever be the same again. Word count 768. Do you want me to move forward and write section 2? Another 760 words, in the same style, picking up the escalation. Got it. Here's section 2 of the Faceless Infidelity script, written in the same tight, direct, no fluff style, with a minimum of 760 words. The shift happened slowly, disguised in the rhythm of ordinary days, until one decision tilted everything out of balance. She lingered longer in conversations with Daniel, their words slipping past work and into personal corners of their lives. What started as comments about long meetings or stressful deadlines turned into confessions about feeling unseen, unappreciated, forgotten. His responses weren't dramatic, but they carried the weight of someone who was actually listening. That kind of attention becomes addictive before you even realize it, and she was already hooked. Every smile he gave her felt like a secret gift, a reassurance she didn't know she had been starving for. Her husband, in turn, was deepening his own secret tether. Elena had become more than just a gym acquaintance. Their chat spilled outside of workouts, filling hours with small messages that made his days brighter. She asked questions his wife never thought to ask anymore, questions that made him reflect, laugh, and feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. When she teased him, when she complimented him, he caught himself replaying her words long after they had left his phone screen. His guilt wasn't strong enough to stop him, it merely sharpened the pleasure. He rationalized it by telling himself it wasn't physical. But desire rarely stays still, it grows, stretches, demands more. For her, the line blurred the day Daniel invited her out for coffee under the guise of a casual break. Sitting across from him outside the office, her pulse raced, not because of what they were doing, but because of what it meant. She laughed too much, leaned in too close, let his gaze linger without breaking it. Every second was a test of self-control she wasn't sure she wanted to pass. She told herself she was still in control, that she could walk away anytime. But the truth was, she had already chosen to stay. At home, the silences grew heavier. She caught her husband smiling at his phone once, and though he quickly hid it, the moment carved a hollow in her chest. She wanted to ask who it was, but didn't, because she knew her own secrets would collapse under the weight of such a question. That unspoken awareness built a fragile truce between them. Don't ask, don't confess, keep pretending. Both were guilty, both complicit, both playing a dangerous game in separate corners of the same house. He began skipping dinners more often, claiming late meetings or longer workouts. She began staying out later herself, blaming traffic or errands. They told themselves these lies were necessary, but the lies only widened the distance. The home became a place of cover stories, not comfort. What bound them together wasn't love anymore, but the routine of marriage, the inertia of shared years. Affection had turned into a shadow, intimacy replaced with secrecy. Her moments with Daniel intensified. The first time his hand stayed too long on hers, she didn't pull back. The electricity of that simple touch sent her spiraling, and though nothing more happened, she carried it like a confession she couldn't speak aloud. Her heart betrayed her every time he leaned close, every time his voice dipped into softness. She began choosing her outfits with him in mind, not her husband, not even herself. Desire reshaped her choices, disguised as ordinary decisions, until everything she did was anchored to him. For her husband, Elena had become more than company. She was temptation in plain sight. He noticed how she adjusted her hair, how she laughed when their eyes met, how she seemed to understand him with effortless ease. He didn't cross the line, but he wanted to. The thought of it played in his head at night, filling the silence where his wife's voice used to be. He fantasized about the what-ifs, the possibilities, the release from the weight of disappointment at home. His longing wasn't for love, but for escape. Both of them told themselves they were victims of neglect, starved of connection in a marriage that had withered. They didn't see that their hunger was driving the very decay they resented. Trust had already eroded, the foundation was fractured. The marriage wasn't destroyed in one moment, but in countless small choices, each one pushing them further apart. She knew she should stop. She knew the thrill of Daniel's attention was dangerous, that every smile, every lingering look was building toward a moment sh.